Okay, folks, welcome back. If you're just tuning in, our first segment, we were talking with Damon Johnson, a real estate executive out of Detroit, Michigan, and the wild market as he sees it. Now we're zooming back here to Brooklyn, New York, with one of my first guests ever when we were live in the studio, Sam Himmelstein. He's a founding partner of Himmelstein, McConnell, Gribben, Donahue, and Joseph on Maiden Lane in Lower Manhattan. Welcome back to the show, Sam. How you doing?
Thanks. Nice to be here. I haven't been to Maiden Lane since March 16th.
Right. I rode into Manhattan once on my bike in May, the day after Memorial Day.
Right.
It was crazy.
Yeah, I've been in Manhattan a couple of times, but I haven't been to the office. Working at home. Yeah.
So I started the show off, I'm not sure if you were listening or not, with a statistic from some news articles earlier this week that said there were over 67,000 vacancies in Manhattan. What's going on? I know when you first came on the show, you were like, that, you know, your particular part of the market had like a victory in legislation, and you were talking about retiring, and you were like, I don't know, we're not getting calls. That's not the case anymore, is it?
No. That changed drastically as of March. We have never, ever had the volume of inquiries from tenants, residential and commercial, that we have had in the last few months. It's constant. We offer a free 10-minute consultation to people who have COVID issues. That I think is attracting a certain number of people, and the calls were all some variant of, I can't pay my rent because I just got laid off. I'm in Broadway, or I worked at a restaurant, or whatever, or I'm moving back home to mom and dad, and I'm going to breach the lease. What are my exposures? Or a business, telling me that, I can't function. I can't pay rent. I've laid off my employees. I have a personal guarantee on my lease. So if they sue me, I could be on the hook. And I have been just doling out advice about this stuff for months. And it's a crisis that is going to worsen severely in the next few months. Because the courts, which were completely shut for a while, except for emergencies, are now gradually reopening. That includes landlord-tenant court and, the civil court where the commercial cases are heard. And cases are being filed. I'm getting calls from clients who are being sued for non-payment of rent. The courts are doing this sort of hybrid thing. The tenant side of the equation is pushing the courts not to reopen. We think it's the equivalent of Black Lives Matter, right? Which, because it has this disproportionate negative effect on people of color, poor people. It's going to increase the homeless population, and the landlord lawyers are saying, well, we want to get back to business, and we want to get back to evicting people, right? So, and the courts are kind of trying to go tread the middle. And so what they've done is they said, well, we're going to reopen. We're going to let people file, but there's not going to be any evictions until September. Or we're not going to process the cases. So, for example, I got hired by a client 2 days ago in a case where normally the papers would say you have to appear in court on X date. It was blank, and it said you'll be notified by the court when the court date is. And that's probably going to be 2 or 3 months away.
Yeah.
So that's how they're kind of trying to, navigate the middle. But once the machinery really begins to gear up again, we're going, unless the courts accept as defenses to these cases some version of economic hardship, we're going to have an eviction crisis. And, traditionally, economic hardship, if I'm a tenant and I go to court and I say, the judge says, why haven't you paid the rent? I say, I don't have the money. I lost my job. The judge will say, yeah, well, when are you moving? Right? Which makes sense, right? The landlord isn't responsible for your economic condition. This is different. This is a government-ordered massive shutdown of businesses, which in turn caused massive amounts of unemployment. People were told they could not go to work. People were told they could not run their businesses, right? How is this not impossibility of performance or frustration of purpose or some other defense that the courts have traditionally not employed in these situations? So as a lawyer, I'm just like chomping at the bit to litigate these issues, because we're hopefully going to make new law, and hopefully it's going to be good for tenants. So
and you would that had just gone through it sometime last year, right? There was when you first came on the show, there was like a really big victory for tenants' rights. So
legislatively, yes. The state legislature in June of 2019 passed the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act, which we've done some research, and it's actually the most massive revamping of a state's landlord-tenant laws in the history of the United States. And all for tenants. Everything went for tenants. And it's really a lesson about local organizing and getting progressive state legislators elected. You know, it's not all national, you know.
Right.
But the vacancy rate issue is interesting on many levels, right? So even though that's true in Manhattan, from what I read, the vacancy rates are pretty steady and the rents are pretty steady in the boroughs, right?
I heard Queens is kind of high too, but Brooklyn seems solid.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we all know, we've heard these stories. People are leaving New York City in droves, you know, because of the pandemic, because there's no work, because it's opened their eyes to alternative suburban or, you know, rural living scenarios, all kinds of reasons. Here's one of the things that's frightening from our perspective as tenant advocates. The existence of the rent stabilization law is dependent upon the city having a 5% or lower vacancy rate.
Yeah, it's at 10 right now.
So if this continues and there's a citywide vacancy rate of over 5% for a long period of time, unless the legislature does something, the rent stabilization laws could expire.
Right.
And that would mean that 800,000 or 900,000 tenants in New York would lose their ability to stay in their apartments and, you know, have very small rent increases. So that's a fright. The theory is that you can't have price controls unless there's some kind of an emergency, right?
Yeah.
Right. So otherwise they'd be unconstitutional. So the emergency that's always declared is the 5% vacancy rate. So, yeah. But it has to be citywide. So
yeah, right now I think it's 10% in Manhattan, but I think, you know, Brooklyn is solid. And I think most of Queens, I think it was more so like all the high rises they built along the East River, you know, facing the city, and people were really like, that's not the place we want to live right now. We need a little more space and backyard. Did they actually extend the moratorium on evictions in New York?
They did through September.
Mid-September, right?
4th, I think.
Oh, is that it?
Or 20th. I'm not sure of the date, but sometime in September, they extended the moratorium on evictions for both residential and commercial tenants, right? But that's coming. What is today's August 21st, right?
Yeah, it's right around the corner.
Right. And again, landlords can file cases now
already. Yeah.
Right. And if necessary, get, you know, in some cases, maybe get a judgment against the tenant. But what's slowing things down for the landlords also is that the courts are not yet allowing in-person appearances for routine cases. The only in-person appearances that they're allowing now are continuing trials that had started pre-March of 2020.
Yeah.
So I've had in the last 2 weeks 8 court appearances, all done the way I'm doing this with you.
Right.
It's kind of nice because I don't have to put on a suit and a tie.
Can you wear your Mets hat?
I don't wear a cap. No. But the joke among us is always that the judge, please don't say all rise. Because
some of you got shorts on.
Or who knows
or
what
nothing.
we got on, right? Sweatpants, shorts, gym shorts. You know, it gives a new meaning to submit your briefs to the court, you know. So.
Sam also moonlights as a stand-up comedian and and frontman for a rock and roll band.
Right.
That's another sad subject we'll have to talk about.
Oh God, music.
Another time.
Yeah.
I just saw there was an article I reposted on Facebook yesterday, and it was, or 2 days ago, and they're attacking businesses statewide now. The state liquor authority is, if you promote a musical event at your establishment.
I saw that.
If it's incidental, if people just show up and there's music there, it's okay.
Yeah.
But if you promote it, they could take your liquor license or fine you up to $10,000. I'm like,
you know, New York's entertainment laws are so antiquated, right? I mean, they have this law like I don't know if it's still on the books, no dancing at a bar, right? So
it's still
we always had to play at bars where the dance floor was out of sight of the street, you know? So it's like crazy, right? Doesn't make sense.
It really doesn't. A lot of it doesn't. I mean, I know they're trying to protect people, but I think they could rethink a couple of their approaches and procedures. I think you'd agree.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, we're going to take one more quick break. We'll come back and we'll chat a little bit more about this. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll be back in just a minute. Okay, everybody, welcome back again. It's Friday afternoon. You're listening to the Entrepreneurial Web. I'm your host, Jeremiah Fox, here with my good friend and neighbor, also a tenant lawyer, Sam Himmelstein. His practice is in Lower Manhattan, but he's been doing everything, even court cases, through Zoom with no rising, because you might not have pants on. No rising.
Right.
So you said something on the last segment about an eviction crisis. You've been in practice for a long time. You're a lifelong New Yorker. Have you seen anything of this level before? I mean, you were here in the 70s and 80s, and things were pretty bleak. How can you compare the two situations?
No, there's nothing close to this. The number of people who are unable to pay their rent or have, you know, not moved out of apartments where their leases have expired because they didn't have any place to go, enough money to move is, I mean, it's anecdotal, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff to read about this if you look online. I always assume that if I'm getting dozens and dozens of calls a day, that's the tip of the iceberg, right? And I'm hearing it from my colleagues in the tenant community that it's going to be massive, and you know, there has to be a larger governmental response somehow, right? I mean, you hear what's going on the Upper West Side, right? Where the liberal Upper West Siders are freaking out about the homeless population, right?
Yeah.
Because they had to put people who were in shelters in hotels temporarily. And I'm not going to comment on the merits of that debate, but the last thing this city needs right now is a massive increase in the homeless population, and in the midst of a pandemic. And a lot of these people are families with children, right? You know, these aren't, you know, what you think of traditional,
right? Like junkies and
yeah. These are families with kids and who are working and paying their rent, and you know, they're humiliated and embarrassed by what's going on. And they're not trying to take advantage of a situation. They've just fallen on hard times. So unless the government comes up with something, one good thing, they did pass a law, which is still in effect, which is that if you can demonstrate COVID hardship between March, April, May, and July, and you get served with an eviction case for non-payment of rent, the court can only enter a money judgment for the rent, meaning you won't get evicted if you don't make that payment. Normally, landlord-tenant court is an eviction court. If you get a judgment against you and you don't satisfy it, not only can the landlord attempt to collect it in the ways one normally collects a judgment, but they can evict you, throw you out with a marshal, right? This law made those months, again, if you can demonstrate COVID hardship, the rent is only a monetary judgment. So that's a slight that's a good start, right? You know,
I mean, you're still on the hook for the money, but
still on the hook for the money,
you're
but
not
you
on
know,
the street yet.
a lot of people in this situation are what we call judgment proof, right? If you don't have any money in the bank and you don't own any property and you are not working, there's nothing to go after, right?
Yeah.
Now, judgments are good for 20 years. So maybe down the road, the landlord will be able to collect it. Yeah,
Yikes.
20 years. And the traditional way that people collect judgments is that they either seize your bank account or they garnish your salary. But they can only take 10% of your salary at any given time. But at least that put a temporary hold on the evictions. But all right, so then what about August and September and October? And, you know, people are still out of work, right? You know, the Broadway shows and the music industry are still completely shut, right?
And think about all the support industries for them too. Those people are losing work left and right.
Incredible, right? I mean, there were all these tours planned. Weren't the Stones supposed to tour? I mean,
you would know better. Call Keith.
Were.
Call Keith. Ask him.
They were. He wouldn't know. What would he know? They just picked him.
Sam's got famous friends. Where's JJ French in all this, man?
That's a good question. I read his stuff. He's blogging a lot about business stuff. So yeah.
Good.
So yeah, there were all like a tour like the Stones must employ hundreds and hundreds of people, right?
Between
travel and stage stuff. Yeah, the construction. But you know, I have a client that's a Broadway ticket broker. Nothing. Nothing. No business.
Yep.
And you know what's crazy, Jeremiah? It's times like this that make me really happy I'm a tenant lawyer and not a landlord lawyer. When you go to the landlords and you say, look, my client's been a good tenant for 10 years or 5 years. They paid their rent on time. They're not doing this deliberately, but they have no business. There's no money coming in. Can we negotiate something? Can we negotiate, let 2 or 3 months go? Can we renegotiate the lease so that it's 25% less over the course of the lease, right? The almost uniform response we get from landlords is, go F yourself. They are not negotiating, and they are being counseled by the organizations that represent them not to negotiate. Theoretically, because they are waiting for some legislation to come down, and they're telling their members, if you make a deal that's more favorable to the tenant than the legislation is, you're going to be stuck with it, right?
Yeah.
But it's not logical, you know, because
no, not at all.
If that tenant leaves, the market is going to be way, way less for that same space than it was. So why wouldn't you keep a tenant that you know and reduce their rent, right? And so all they're doing, most landlords, there are some exceptions, they're doing what we call deferral agreements, where they say, okay, don't pay 3 months rent, but we're going to tack it on to next year's rent, right? So it really doesn't answer the question ultimately of what do you do for those months when you had absolutely no business.
And some of those people might not be back to work even next year because nobody knows what's going to happen.
And, you know, when I talk to my colleagues in the landlord bar, even they acknowledge that they don't understand the unwillingness to negotiate in this scenario. It seems to be the perfect situation where everybody could come out with something instead of, you know, forcing it to court and everybody coming out with nothing. So
no, I've heard about it from the commercial sector, not so much from residential where we're at, but it seems like they're holding on to like a dying mentality that, you know, it's not servicing them, but they're just so stuck in the pattern they can't see past it. Which brings to mind like some of the articles that were coming out lately, and they're like, you know, New York is dead. I mean, as a lifelong New Yorker, how do you feel about right now?
It's scary, but I think it's going to come back. But I think it's going to be changed inalterably in ways that we never could have expected. I think the ways of doing business in New York are going to change permanently. So For example, I attended a CLE in like May with my ethics counsel, and it was about, you know, how to transfer over to remote practicing and electronic filings and all this stuff. And they opened the session by saying, we all knew these changes were coming, and we expected them over the next 10 to 20 years. They're going to be here in the next year or two.
Yeah,
right.
Expect it overnight.
Yeah, it's going to happen overnight. I think the commercial real estate market is going to be inalterably affected because everyone now is understanding that they don't need as much office space, if any.
Right.
I represent a group of doctors in Soho who switched over to, they're psychiatrists, and they switched over to remote sessions when the pandemic hit, and their clients are all telling them, we don't want to go back to the other ones. They don't need an office anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And they had, you know, several thousand square feet in Soho. So
it's going to change a lot of things.
Yep. Now, you know, on the other hand, there are the handful of, I have one landlord, I'm representing a group of tenants on 23rd Street, and he's saying we will lower everybody's rent by a proportion that they can demonstrate that their business has dropped off.
Yeah.
Right. So show me what your receipts were before, a year ago. If you can show me that you're, you know, down 50%, we'll lower your rent 50%. When your rent goes back, when your income goes back up, we'll raise it back up. That to me seems like a perfectly logical solution.
And pre-COVID, there were leases that operated that way, where it was a floating rent based off your revenue because people experience seasonal adjustments, you know, especially in some of the bigger buildings. And I think going forward, there's going to be kind of a pandemic response written into the riders of a lot of commercial leases. Yeah. Like nobody's just going to be like, I don't know, we'll see if this happens again. It's going to be like, no, there's going to be in writing how you know each party will respond, and in a way that'll support both, you know, and not lean one way or the other. And hopefully, you know, everybody gets out with their shirts still.
We call that a force majeure clause.
Okay. Yeah. I got some research to do.
Yeah. And most of them, the way they're written, specifically exclude this kind of situation. So,
yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up. Where can people get in touch with you if they have questions?
Let's see. If we have a Facebook page and we have a website, if you just Google Himmelstein McConnell, it will pop up everywhere. Our offices are open, but most of us are working part-time or remotely, but our phones are working and we're fielding calls. But the best place is usually at our website or our Facebook page.
Awesome. Well, Thank you so much. I wish you the best. Keep up the good work. You've always been a great guy and an inspiration to me. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremiah.
Thank you. And as this kind of, you know, unravels, we'll have you come back on and do like periodic check-ins, because people stop me on the street all the time and they're like, what do I do? I don't want to give them all your phone number.
No. If there were parties now, I'd be very popular at parties.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again, Sam. Everybody have a great weekend. We'll check in with you next week. You listen to the Entrepreneurial Web.